This week, the class will be held in the Applied Biomechanics Research Laboratory. We will be using the motion capture system, force platforms, and electromyography to conduct several experiments. In preparation, I'd like you to have a basic background in biomechanical testing. Please read the signed reading that goes with this lecture to learn about the technologies used in biomechanics. Quantitative biomechanics involves analysis of human movement and the underlying causes of the movement using numbers. In quantitative biomechanics, kinematic variables such as position, displacement, velocity, and acceleration, and kinetic variables such as the forces acting on the body and forces produced by the muscles are described in numbers. The benefit of using numbers to describe kinematics and kinetics is that it allows us to be objective in our analysis. The quantitative analysis also allows us to evaluate subtle changes in motion, movements that occur too fast to see with our eyes, or capturing information that cannot be seen or perceived by the researcher, such as the force experienced by the jumper upon landing and forces produced by the muscle. Data collection can take place either in a laboratory setting or in a real-life setting. Data collection in either setting has its advantages and disadvantages. The major advantage in collecting data in a laboratory setting is the amount of control you can have over the testing condition. The disadvantage of laboratory setting is that the testing is not conducted in the environment that is natural to the subjects. Unfamiliarity with the setting can affect the way they choose to move. On the other hand, being able to study the movement in a natural environment for the subject is the advantage of conducting testing in a real-life setting. However, testing in real-life environment may restrict the type of equipment that can be used for testing and may be affected by weather and other environmental factors. Most data in biomechanics are continuously changing. The continuous data are sampled at certain frequency at discrete time interval before being recorded on the computer. The data that is continuously changing is called the analog data, and the numerical data that are recorded at discrete time interval is called the digital data. The sampling rate refers to the rate at which the analog signal is sampled and recorded on the computer. The sampling rate can be measured in frames per second for data collected using video devices and measured in hertz in other types of data. When the data are collected at 100 hertz, this means that the digital data are sampled 100 times each second. The appropriate sampling frequency depends on the type of data that is being collected, but the sampling rates needs to be high enough to correctly characterize the true data. The figure above is showing the analog data sampled at 80 Hz. The blue line represents the analog data, and the red dots represent the data sampled at a rate of 80 times a second. When you connect the red dots, the line would closely resemble the true data. The figure below is showing the analog data sampled at 10 Hz. The blue line represents the analog data, and the red dots represent the data sampled at the rate of 10 times each second. When you connect the red dots, you can see that the line that results deviates from the blue line and does not properly characterize the true data. This is why it is important to use appropriate sampling frequency when collecting data. The commonly used sampling frequency varies by the type of data being collected. The standard video cameras capture video at a rate of 30 to 60 frames per second. The motion capture system that we use in the lab can capture data at much higher rate. When we capture relatively slow movements, such as walking and jumping, sampling frequency of 100 frames per second should be adequate. However, when capturing fast movements like baseball pitching, hitting, or kicking, much higher sampling frequency is used. The force plate data are typically collected at 1000 Hz. The signal from the electromyography are sampled at 1000 Hz for surface electrodes and 2000 Hz for fine wire electrodes. Many types of tools are used to capture kinematics. Something as simple as a stopwatch or electronic clock that records start and stop can be considered an instrumentation to measure the time it takes for the subject to complete the task. The time data can be used to calculate average velocity. If you measure the time it took for a runner to run a mile, you can calculate the average velocity of the runner by dividing the distance 1 mile by the time. A radar gun is a commonly used instrument to measure velocity of a moving object. Video cameras can be used to conduct two-dimensional analysis of motion. When using the video to conduct two-dimensional analysis of motion, the camera must be aimed perpendicular to the motion of interest. The video images can be analyzed using apps and software to calculate positions and angles of the body segment. The analysis typically requires a process called digitization, or identification of the location of joints in each video frames. This digitization can be done manually by the user or automatically within the software. The accelerometers are used to directly measure the object's acceleration. The accelerometers can typically sample data at a high frequency and therefore can be used to analyze impact and vibration of the objects. The force applied to the object during the impact is equal to the mass of the object times its acceleration. This is why accelerometer can be used to analyze impact force. An inertial measurement unit, or an IMU, is a relatively new type of sensor that integrates accelerometer, gyroscope, and magnetometer to calculate orientation of the sensor relative to the gravitational field. An accelerometer measures acceleration, gyroscope measures angular velocity, and magnetometer measures the orientation of the sensor from the magnetic north. The key advantage of this type of sensor is that it is portable and therefore can be used to capture movement in real-life environments. In our lab, we will use a motion capture system to collect the kinematic data. The picture on the bottom right shows you the lab setup with cameras aimed at the center of the lab space. These cameras pick up the reflections from the reflective markers that are attached to the subject's anatomical landmarks. The software can integrate the information from all cameras to calculate the position of each reflective markers in X, Y, and Z directions. Force platforms or force plates are lab equipment that is used to measure forces. Specifically, the force platforms are used to measure ground reaction force. When a person lands on the ground, the mass and acceleration of the person pushes down on the ground. The ground reaction force is the force that acts back on the person from the ground. By having the person land on the force plate, we can measure how much force is applied to the person upon landing. The force platform can also calculate the location of the center of pressure on the force plate. The movement of the center of pressure is often used to assess balance. The figures on the right side of the slide show the movement of the center of pressure during the balance test for the elderlies with and without history of falling. You can see that the faller's center of pressure is moving around a lot more than the non-faller, indicating poor balance. Electromyography is a device used to capture electrical activity from the muscles. The electrical activity from the muscles can be used to estimate the force produced by the muscle. Surface electromyography requires placement of the electrodes on the skin over a superficial muscle. Indwelling electromyography involves insertion of fine wire electrodes into the muscle to study the electrical activity. In our lab, we will use the surface electromyography on the deltoid muscle to study the activation level. In this week's lab, we will put a total of 22 markers on the volunteers from our class and have him or her perform 5 different tasks. In order to carry out the lab in a timely manner, please make sure to read the lab and familiarize yourself with the activity before coming to class.